Welcome to another edition of CHP Talks. We are here today with Dr. Irving Hexham, and we're going to be talking about embedded Christianity. So before we jump into it, I'm going to read Dr. Hexham's bio and by way of introduction. So Irving Hexham left school at 15 to become an apprentice gas fitter in Stockport, England. An evangelical conversion at the age of 18 dramatically changed his life and put him on a path that led to Francis Schaeffer and L'Abri, where he was encouraged to study world religions at university. Subsequently, he gained his BA honors in religious studies from the University of Lancaster, where he studied with Neenan Smart. He obtained his master's in religious studies and theology with commendation from the University of Bristol, where he also completed his PhD in history. His master's thesis was the first British study of the New Age movement, while his PhD dealt with the origins of apartheid as an ideology. And both of these theses addressed contemporary challenges to Christian faith. After teaching at Bishop Lonsdale College, an Anglican institution in Derby, England, he moved to the Evangelical Christian Graduate School of Theology, Regent College in Vancouver, BC. And from there, he went to the University of Manitoba and eventually moved to the University of Calgary, where he is a full professor of religious studies. Irving is an elected fellow of both the Royal Anthropological Institute and the Royal Historical Society, and listed in Who's Who in Canada. He has published 37 books, short monographs, and reports, in addition to 83 academic articles and chapters in books, plus another 72 short academic encyclopedia articles. His scholarly articles have appeared in leading academic journals such as African Affairs, the Journal of Contemporary History, Quers, and Religion Compass, Nova Religio, the Journal of Contemporary Religion, Religion Studies in Religion, and the well, this is a German one, so I'm going to just leave that one. His book include Understanding Cults and New Religions, and written with his wife, Carla Poe, and the Concise Dictionary of Religion. Both are available as free PDF downloads from Understanding World Religions. His latest book is Understanding World Religions, and Irving's writings are translated into Dutch, German, Portuguese, Russian, and Spanish. In 2008, he was awarded Festschrift at the Humboldt University in Berlin. His title is Border Crossings, the Explorations of Interdisciplinary Historian, edited by Ulrich von Heyden, etc. In addition to his academic work, Irving frequently speaks in churches and to Christian groups. He has given numerous popular lectures and published articles in Christianity Today, Christian Week, Charisma, and Third Way, the Christian Research Journal, and various other magazines and newspapers. He's also a regular radio and television broadcaster in Canada and has lectured in universities worldwide. Most recently, he participated in a 10-part series for the History Channel on miracles. And you can find more about him at the University of Calgary website. So, Dr. Hexham, that's an introduction, and there's some things there that we want to pick up on, basically understanding our Christian roots, I suppose, in Canada, and also where you have come from and where you've studied and where you want to give us a better understanding of some things today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
With all those accomplishments, Dr. Hexham, thank you. I don't know how you find time to sit down with us today, but we thank you for taking the time to fill us in on a few little pieces of all that knowledge and experience that you have.
Thank you.
So embedded Christianity, how does that, how do you want to develop that, and where did you get that idea?
Well, I think maybe a little more background than I've already given you would fit in. When I went to university, I went obviously as a Christian, and I went to study, but I went to a secular university. And the reason I did this, and the reason I started studying world religions at Lancaster University, which was the first university in Britain to offer a religious studies course. This was started by the Professor Ninian Smart. When I was talking to Francis Schaeffer about my background, I was simply, when I first met him, I was still a gas fitter. And, you know, I went to L'Abri because a friend of mine took me along to L'Abri to meet Schaeffer. She thought I ought to have contact with him. And Schaeffer was very gracious. And here I was as somebody who's a tradesman. And there were, at the time, a couple of professors from America there and lots of other people who were from universities or students and things like that. And Schaeffer invited me. He often invited people. He met them over meals and things, and then he gave discussion groups where he talked with people. But he also invited people to go up to his office and to have a chat. And he invited me and spent almost an entire morning talking with me, which was really surprising because, you know, who was I? And in actual fact, one of the American professors who was there was quite rude to me afterwards. He couldn't understand why Schaeffer wasted his time talking to a plumber and didn't talk to him. He came out and said it. It was quite shocking. But Schaeffer asked me about the work I was doing, and I was working in one of those towns in the north of England, Ashton-under-Lyne, and there was a large immigrant population. There were Hindus and Muslims and Buddhists there, mainly Hindus and Muslims though, and I had to go into their homes and work there, and you know, it was different to other sort of normal work in an English household because they had various health regulations that they believed in, or religious regulations about things like if you have a bath, you've got to have running water. That was from one particular group. And one had to learn this. And Schaeffer heard about it and was fascinated and said, well, you know, you ought to study world religions because this is going to be an area where Christians are falling behind. And they've got to be prepared for what's coming because through immigration, we're going to get a lot of people coming into the West. It's more advanced in Britain than it is in America, but it will come to America too. And so we need Christians to be prepared for that. And so that was what got me initially interested in looking at world religions. I then did my undergraduate degree and I did a MA in religious studies. And in these, I looked at, as you said, the first New Age movement in Britain, which was very relevant. It was, as you can see, there's sort of an apologetic edge to this. And one of the things which British newspapers talked about at that time was that Christians had created apartheid. And you got this very regularly. The British newspapers were highly critical of South Africa and what was happening in South Africa. And they inevitably tried to explain the origins of apartheid in terms of Calvinism. It was because the whites believed they were elect, they treated the blacks badly. Well, as a Christian, and as a Christian who was strongly influenced by the Calvinist tradition, I thought there was something wrong here, because even at a secular university at Lancaster, when I did history, we were taught that the origins of the modern democratic systems, the origins of British democracy and American democracy, was rooted in Calvinism. So if the origins of our societies have political traditions which are democratic and they are rooted in Calvinism, how could it happen that in South Africa you get a group of Calvinists who go in exactly the opposite direction, that they deny democratic rights to blacks? So that was a problem. And when you get a PhD, or when you start studying for a PhD, a lot of people stumble into it. But I'd started late, and you know, I'd had a career at the gas board. I'd been for a couple of years in management at the gas board, and I knew when I went to university that I was giving up a good career, and therefore I got to continue through to a PhD. That was my intention, and it was intention to go in and work and develop as a Christian scholar, and as far as possible, if a job came up, to work in a secular university. I think, again, another comment, in Britain, there are far more Christian professors in secular universities than in North America. In North America, they tend to go into Christian colleges, which, you know, is good. The Christian colleges do a lot of good, but I think something is also lost at the same time. And in my experience of working in a secular university in North America, I find many Christian students and also Christian academics are sometimes very defensive Christian. And this was apparent to me at things like the American Academy of Religion, where it was decided to create an evangelical subgroup. And I was in at the beginning of this discussion, starting this group. This was many years ago. And as soon as we decided to do it, we were going to have a speaker the following year, and I suggested getting Ninian Smart. Now, Ninian wasn't an evangelical, but he was well recognized as a professor of religious studies, a founder of the field of religious studies, and he would have been an ideal person to get because he was well known, and he would come to this evangelical group that would probably draw other people as well, people on the fringe. And for him to talk to it, I thought would give us a good start. Nobody liked the idea because he was from a secular university, and they were worried that he wasn't evangelical enough. So I think this gives some idea about my approach. I think Christians have got to be engaged in the professions. They've got to be engaged, particularly in academia. And I don't think they can always go to Christian colleges. They need to reach out into the world. Now, this, I think, sets me up to talk about embedded Christianity. Now, I wonder if you have any questions before I go on to talk about that.
Well, I just would say that, of course, of the Christian Heritage Party, we believe in, the foundations of Christianity being foundational to our culture and society and government structures and justice system and so on in Canada. But I think that's a slightly different thread than embedded, because what we're experiencing today in our culture, and especially through the government, is things that are happening that do not reflect Christian values. And we sort of feel like, in Canada at least, that the government policies and approach has wandered away from those foundations. So I think I'm intrigued in the concept of embedded, because that sounds like bringing those realities back into touch with society. So look forward to your comments there.
Yes, I think this is true. I think you've got there's an attempt to remove Christianity from public life in Canada. And so it's anything but embedded in the way in which the current government, at least, and a lot of people in politics see it. They want to get rid of the Christian element. This was particularly noticeable a few years ago in Alberta when the NDP came to power. Now, I would have thought that when the NDP came to power, they would have remembered their history and at least been sympathetic to Christianity. But in actual fact, many of the people were quite hostile to the Christian message, and particularly to Christian schools, and they created a lot of problems for Christians. And yet the NDP was founded by Christians. Originally, its roots are in the CCF and in Christian political movements. So something has gone very much astray. What I mean by embedded Christianity, this was a concept that, I don't know what that noise is, sorry. The embedded Christianity was a concept which we came across in our research in Germany. And I should say that my research originally was on the hippies of Glastonbury. I then went on and studied apartheid in South Africa and the origins of Afrikaner nationalism. And after that, I did a lot of work on African religions, African religious movements. So I spent a lot of time working with African materials. And then after at the time, 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, just before that, a friend of ours who was the head of a large African independent church, the Amanazareta, Londa Shembi, we were going to go in the summer and work with him on his church and the history of his church and what exactly it believed, and even whether they were Christian or not. They claimed to be Christian, but there was all sorts of, I can say this, Londa said to us, I'm not even sure. He inherited the church from his father and his grandfather, and he said, I'm not even sure whether we're Christian or we're Jewish. I've got to think this through and work it out. I'm the leader of the church. I'm the prophet of the church. It sounds crazy for me to say it. You might think I'm mad, he said to me, but I'm not sure. I want to work it out. And so he was very astutely aware of the problems, and he was studying the Bible very closely at that point. But then he was assassinated. And no one quite knows why or when, how these people came to do it, who they were, but they assassinated him anyway. And so that ruined our research. And you can imagine this was a few weeks before we were going to go and spend the summer working with him. And we got the message that he'd been murdered very brutally. So my wife said to me after that, when the Berlin Wall came down, she said, well, the mission societies, the area of Zambia where I did anthropological research, was a place where there'd been a lot of German missions in the past. They'd shaped the Christianity. But I never dared go to East Berlin to look in the archives, because she herself was a refugee from East Germany. And, there was always a chance, even though she'd been a little girl when they left, there was always a chance the East Germans might say, no, you're an East German, you're not a Canadian, you stay here. And so she'd never come back. So we went back to the archives in East Germany. The wall had come down. Carla started working in them. And she was working originally on the missions, but then she found fascinating material about the Nazis. And the mission had an ongoing battle with the Nazis from the very beginning, from the 1920s. And in the 1920s, before the Nazis seized power, there were big debates in Berlin between Nazi spokesmen and members of the mission. And the mission was against what the Nazis stood for. So this was interesting, and this led Carla to write a book called New Religions and the Nazis. It's gone out of print, unfortunately, and we hope to get it back in print, but at present Amazon is selling it for $700, which is a little paperback. So, I wouldn't ask people to go out and buy it. But we hope it will come back in print fairly soon. But this book was about them, and the fact that really the Nazis were a neo-pagan movement. And this is something that has been disputed by people. It was something which was recognized before the war. If you read any of the people who wrote about it, Jews and Christian writers who opposed the Nazis would say they were neo-pagan. And it continued to be regarded as neo-pagan right down to the 1980s and 1990s. And then a new group of scholars came up, and they all to write something different. This is the way I see it. And so they started saying, or started arguing, that really the church had collaborated and some people in the church did collaborate, but really the church and Christians were responsible for National Socialism. And this has become a dominant theme in some scholarly places. And there's even websites put up by some Christians who condemn the German church for not doing enough against the Nazis. Now, that's easy to say when you live in North America. If you've studied the situation and one looks at the fact that the first thing they did in 1933, one of the first acts, the Nazis seized control of East Prussia, and they arrested 700 pastors and put them in concentration camps. Nobody knows about this. So this got us engaged in a different type of research, looking at Germany. And as a result of that research, we've been going back. Carla did the work for her book in the German archives, the federal archives, government archives in Koblenz and other places. When she was doing that, I was still finishing off some of my books on African independent churches. I had a lot of editing to do, and that kept me going right well into the 2000s. And then once I got that all published, and these are very dry academic books. They're not the sort of thing that your readers would want to look at, your listeners. But after that, I turned myself, I joined Carla in doing research on National Socialism and the way in which they really were a thoroughgoing pagan group. And this has been substantiated by some German scholars like Peter Longerich, who's published a superb book on Heinrich Himmler. It's a biography of Himmler, and he spends over 200 pages pointing out the neo-pagan elements of the SS, which Himmler was keen on developing. Himmler really wanted to create a new religion. So that is part of the background. Now, as we were doing this, and Carla's book came out, she got invited, and then I got invited to a conference in America run by a German scholar, Uwe Seemann Netto, who had actually been a reporter for the Associated Press, and he had covered the Vietnam War. He speaks English fluently, and he's married to an English woman. And Uwe also became concerned about what was going on, and he published a book, The Fabricated Luther. And The Fabricated Luther deals with the problem that many people are now saying that Martin Luther was responsible for the Holocaust. Because Martin Luther wrote a booklet called The Jews and Their Lies. Now, it's true the Nazis picked up on that booklet and republished it in the 1930s, but what Uwe argues is that if you look at German history and the history of the booklet, first of all, it's an exposition of Jewish expositions of the Bible. That what he calls their lies is they misinterpret the Bible. And that's what it was about. It wasn't just ranting totally about the Jews. But secondly, it was forgotten after Luther died. And the Nazis dug it up, but it didn't create the Nazis. The Nazis were able to use it, unfortunately, but it wasn't something that brought Nazism into existence. So he was very concerned about this, and his book on Luther, The Fabricated Luther, because he looks at the way the Nazis fabricated Luther. This is a problem, and this is something which has dogged German history as well, the whole role of the Nazis. But immediately after the Second World War, the big question which the Germans faced was, how do we prevent the rise of another form of National Socialism? How did this disaster happen, and how can it be prevented? And it was generally agreed by Germans and others was that the way to prevent it was to install Christian values in the society, that Christians had opposed the Nazis, and there are some very good examples. Everyone knows Bonhoeffer, but there are many other people who lost their lives for opposing the Nazis. And Christian values, well, how do you do this? This was a question they faced. And there's a certain amount of information. I've got a book here which I can show to your readers, A Historian's Pilgrimage by Frank Ike. It's published by Fogelstein Press. Frank Ike was a professor at the University of Calgary. He was Jewish. He grew up as a Jew in Berlin. His family fled Germany before the Nazis could lock them up, and they went to England. He went to boarding school in England, so he was a perfect English gentleman as well, apart from being German also. And he was in the British Army during the Second World War. And as he says, he was only a sergeant, but he was also very deeply involved in British intelligence. And then after the war, he was given a task in a town called Flensburg to re-establish the newspaper. So he set up the Flensburg newspaper, and they honored him about that for doing that in, I think, the year 2000. But Frank, unfortunately, has since died, but he was a strong influence on us because Frank was a Jew who became a Christian. He converted to Christianity on D-Day, I think D-Day +1. And then he was in the army, and he went across into Germany and worked in intelligence again. But he was in the town of Bath in England, and that's where he became a Christian through the Methodists. And his wife was a German. His widow is a German, Rosemary Ike, who was a medical doctor, and her family had opposed the Nazis, and they were well known, or they knew most of the people who had been involved in opposition to the Nazis. So there is this tradition of opposition. And the question that was faced by the German politicians, and Frank talks about this because in his autobiography, he talks about going back to Germany as a soldier and how do they help create this new society. And that was part of the aim of the British government. And the British government, I don't know how much the Americans went along with it, but the British thought that you've got to really spread Christianity. You've got to promote Christianity in Germany to prevent a resurgence of Nazism. And this was certainly something which the former mayor of Cologne, Konrad Adenauer, who had to oppose the Nazis, and then during the war, he was a Roman Catholic, the Nazis wanted to, before the war even, wanted to put him in a concentration camp. He escaped, and he went to a Catholic monastery called Maria's Lake, and the priests there took him in and hid him. The Nazis raided it a couple of times because they thought he might be there, but they never found him, and he survived the war. And after the war, he became again the mayor of Berlin. Then he became, not Berlin, the mayor of Cologne, and then the leader and founder of the Christian Democratic Union. And in founding this political movement, his big question, and he apparently first used the term, was how do we build Christianity into our society? We've got this generation now in Germany that's been educated by the Nazis, young people who have known nothing but them. We've got people who've been influenced by their propaganda. How do we not only prevent that, but start to roll it back? And he said, well, it's got to be done subtly, and it's got to be built into society. So they went about constructing something which they didn't talk about very widely, but a type of Christian basis for German society. And so one of the things which strikes one today when you go to Germany, and it had existed before the war, but it had been eroded by the Nazis, is the celebration of festivals. I mean, in Canada, Easter is forgotten about. You know, we don't celebrate Easter anymore. Good Friday isn't I don't know whether it's still a holiday, but I don't think it is a holiday anymore. In Germany, you go Good Friday, Easter, Monday, Whitsun, the Feast of Pentecost. These are all religious holidays. So they built these into the society. And this was part of the embedding of Christianity in society, but it went a lot deeper than that. It tried to build into German consciousness that being a Christian was important. And I think they've been largely successful. You may remember, I mean, people like and hate, and they love and hate Angela Merkel, but Angela Merkel is a devout Christian. Now, you know, we might not all agree with her Christianity, but she's certainly a devout Christian, and she has no hesitation saying, I am a Christian. So to give an example of her attitudes and the way German politicians approached this was the question of gay marriage came up a few years ago. And as Chancellor, they wanted a free vote. There was a push for a free vote on that. And Mrs. Merkel said, well, I'm responsible to the country. We can have a free vote on this. I'm opposed to gay marriage. They can have gay unions, but not a gay marriage. But as a Christian, I can't go along. Marriage is men and women. But never mind. We have also got a democratic responsibility, and we'll have a free vote. And the German people voted for, or Parliament voted to allow gay marriage. And Mrs. Merkel accepted it. But I can't imagine a politician in Canada saying, I'm a Christian and I really am opposed to gay marriage, without them being really lambasted by the press and by everybody else for being bigots. But nobody said that of Mrs. Merkel, because they respected her as a person. They respected her belief as a Christian, but also her willingness to recognize certain things in society that maybe the majority wanted. So she balances democracy with her personal beliefs. And she doesn't try to force her beliefs down, but she wants to encourage her beliefs. She wants to encourage these things. And this is where this institution comes in, which they have in Germany, which is a unique institution called Johannistag. Now, Johannistag is St. John's Day. And we didn't really know about this, but we'd met a man called Christian Meisner through Uwe Simon Netto, and we visited him in Germany in 2011, and we were sitting in his office having coffee, and he invited us to, he said, oh, my former professor from the University of Hamburg is in town tonight. Would you like to hear a lecture on theology? And so we said, oh, yeah, we'd love to hear that. We'll come along. And he said, yes, well, it's at the Huguenot Church, or the Huguenot Cathedral in Berlin. It's central Berlin. Come along to it. And so we said we would, and he told us it was at 6:30. So we went home, we had something to eat, and then we set off to listen to this lecture. And we'd been working in archives and things. We were wearing jeans and looking a bit scruffy. And as we were approaching the church, there were all these dressed up people going there. And my wife said to me, I think they're going where we're going. And I said, don't be silly. You know, they're not going to a lecture. But when we got there, they were all going into the church, and we had to go through an entrance, and they checked our names as to whether we'd seats allocated and everything, and we were then let in. And there was a couple of other security people there. It was a bit strange. And so we're sitting there, and it's supposed to be starting at 6:30, and it's 6:40. And I turn to my wife and say, you know, I thought Germans were supposed to be efficient and on time. This is as bad as in Calgary. It's not started on time. And as I said that, the door opened at the front of the church, and in walked Angela Merkel, followed by the entire cabinet and then the opposition. And they filled up all the seats at the front. And then this man was introduced. There was a prayer, there was a hymn, and he then gave a lecture on what the government had done right and what it had done wrong in the previous year from a Christian viewpoint. And this lecture, Johannistag lecture, has been going on for since the 1950s, and it takes place every year. And in some years, the government is apparently lambasted for making mistakes and doing things that are unchristian, and in other years, they're praised for doing Christian things. But the government members, the members of the opposition, even people who are not known to be committed believers, turn up and hear what the church has got to say and what Christianity's got to say. I shouldn't say the church, because although it is organized by the main churches, it's a matter of bringing in Christian ethics and a Christian perspective to politics, and reminding politicians that they are not the last word. God is the last word, and that they are responsible to God. And again, I think this is the type of thing which somehow all our countries could benefit from. Britain and Canada and the United States, if somehow one could develop a sensitivity so that even a non-Christian politician would want to hear what Christians have got to say. And this is what I think the Germans have an advantage over us in this case, that they have created this system which causes people to stop and think of, what is the religious issue. And the EAK is an organization, the Evangelical Working Group of CDU, and it's got its headquarters in the main offices of the political party, the Christian Democratic Union. And they have 5 or 6 people working there whose job is to be pastors in a secular sense. They are there as pastors for particularly the members of the CDU, the MPs, the app coordinator, and people working in the CDU's offices and planning strategy and things to discuss whether what they're doing is Christian and to discuss moral problems. And the interesting thing about this is that Christian Meisner, this friend of ours, works there, and he says that they get members of other political parties, even the left, will come in and ask to talk to them about moral issues and about whether or not there is a political policy, what's its implications and how are people going to react to it. Now, I think this is quite remarkable, and this is what I mean by embedded Christianity. How do Christians work together to get respect for Christianity in Canada so that people who are in public life will say, well, I may not be a Christian, and I think Christianity is stupid, but there are a lot of people who are Christians, and we need to take their views seriously, and we need to think about what we're doing in terms of their beliefs. But also, one can extend this. That would be, there are many Muslims in our country, there are many Hindus and Buddhists. They also can join in the conversation with politicians and say their piece. And unfortunately, they all get excluded. Our system is secular in the sense that is, secular has come to mean anti-religious, not non-religious. It's not a neutrality, it's not a neutral position, but religion is being pushed out. And the question is, how do we get people to take religion seriously, and Christianity in particular seriously, because the majority of Canadians would claim to be Christian. And this is something which I think politicians need to recognize, whatever they think about Christianity, and not just make fun of it.
Wow. Well, some very good points, some very challenging points. And I think in some ways, CHP has been trying to do some of these things that you have talked about in terms of bringing a wide swath of Christianity together and speaking clearly and coherently on some of the issues of the day. And the only challenge is that the audience is small, but we have gained the ear of some members of Parliament over time, and we do get approached with respect from time to time. It's just a challenge to take it to the next level. And of course, we're not an institution in the same way that Germany has institutionalized some of these checks and balances that bring their politicians to a Christian a reminder. It's really a simple thing, yeah, but certainly needed. Yeah.
The media and a lot of the educational system in the country over time has, I'm not going to say conspired, but has worked together, maybe even unconsciously, to give the idea that, they use the term separation of church and state, but it has become, in effect, a separation of morality from public policy, and specifically public policy that might be come from Christian roots. When they say keep religion out of the schools, for instance, there's not a recognition that atheism or secular atheism or even evolutionary beliefs are a form of religion as well. Some of the environmental movement has religious overtones, but they've been able to portray themselves as a neutral, and in fact it's not so. But so we kind of have to come up against that and to present our ideas, put ourselves on a level playing field with them. We have to get people to recognize that our ideas also have a legitimate place in the public sphere, and that is a challenge. But I think you've done a great job of presenting to us some of, this story of Germany and what has happened in Germany, and how those Christian values have been embedded in their society is certainly inspiring, and we hope that we can put some of those ideas into practice.
No, the challenge is great. I recognize that, and I'm not sure how one would actually get it into place in a place like Canada, but I think it gives a model for people to look to. And I don't think people are aware of it. I mean, I'm certain people are not aware of it. You wouldn't be aware of it, except when you're living in Germany. When we've been on research trips, we've noticed, that there are all these Christian holidays, and there is a respect for Christianity generally in the society, even though in some ways Germany is far more secular than we are. In other ways it isn't. And it is this gaining respect, I think, which is important.
Well, thank you for doing that extensive research and for bringing the concepts to us today. It's been very valuable time. Thank you, Dr. Hexham.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, thank you all for listening, and we hope you've learned something. I think it's been a very educational talk. Thank you again, Dr. Hexham. We hope to talk to you again in the future, and we hope all of you listening will tune in again for another edition of CHP Talks next week. God bless you.